Oh yeah.
Welcome back, bastards, brigands, sirens, and scoundrels, and of course, scruffy-looking nerf herders. I am the Brigand Bob, and today we are going to talk about modifying a stock AR trigger, or a Milspec AR trigger, as it were. So this guy right here, I'm going to replace the trigger pins in it because they keep walking loose. So I'm going to put some anti-walk pins in it, and I figured while I was in there, I would show you a little modification that I like to do for Milspec triggers that is safe, cheap, and easy to do. So we're going to go ahead and head on over to the bench. Okay, we're in the garage at the workbench, and I have removed the upper and the sling from the lower, and now I'm going to go ahead and take my trusty roll punch, which in this case is 9/64. Camera focus, 9/64 roll punch. And I'm going to take this punch and just drive out the trigger pins from the lower receiver. Now, when you're driving out the pin for the hammer, I recommend dropping the hammer. So take off safety, drop the hammer, and make sure you retain the hammer because it's got some tension in there. So it's going to try to like fly out. So there, I'm holding on to it. The pin has dropped. The hammer did not go sailing across the garage or pop out of my rifle. So I can go ahead and set that to the side. And now I can go ahead and do the same thing for the trigger. The trigger isn't as bad as far as being spring loaded in there. It's got a little bit of tension, but it's not as bad as the hammer. So now I've got both of my roll pins out, as you can see. And we're just going to slide the trigger assembly out as well. I'm going to go ahead and remove the disconnector first before trying to slide the trigger out. There we go. So now I've taken both the hammer and the trigger out. So the first thing that you want to do is swap out the springs. So I have, JP Enterprises spring kit right here. But before I put these new springs on, the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to obviously remove this spring. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bob this hammer. And the reason that I'm going to bob this hammer is because with lighter springs, you can get light hammer strikes, or light primer strikes. And that's not a lot of fun. When you're at the range and you pull the trigger and you hear a click and there's no bang, you eject the round and you find a light primer strike. That's disappointing, to say the least, so it's not a lot of fun. So bobbing the hammer will solve this. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but by reducing the mass of the hammer, that will compensate for the lighter spring and it will move faster when it's released. You would think it's the other way around, but it's not, I promise you. So by bobbing the hammer, you will reduce or eliminate light primer strikes entirely. So what I'm going to do first is score this. I say score it, I just mean mark it. So I'm just going to make a mark on the hammer where I want to cut it. And really I'm going to cut it as close to this arch as I can. So there we go. And that is why you see my trusty Dremel out here on the table. Now this is a diamond cutter, so this is going to be sufficient. I've used this for this material, cutting material for cutting and bobbing steel hammers in the past, so shouldn't be any different this time. It is very important to remember to use iPro, and I also like to double down on being safe and wear face covering, primarily so I'm not breathing in metal particles. So like an N95 mask, or really just like about any kind of mask, is going to do the trick, because those metal particles are pretty large, so it's not like you're dealing with super fine particles, but you don't want to be inhaling them because that would suck. So I'm going to go ahead and put this guy on. Okay, so we are good to go. We're going to get started here. All right, so we are back at the bench. I finished grinding down the hammer here, and as you can see, it's not the cleanest bob cut I've done. A little bit of deformation there, but for the most part, it looks good, and most importantly, it accomplishes the job of reducing the mass of the hammer itself, so that head will strike with enough force with a lightened spring to hit that firing pin and properly ignite the primer. So let's go ahead and get right to it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and replace these springs on both the trigger and the hammer, and we will also replace the disconnector spring as well. I forget this step often, but if you get a new spring set and it comes with a disconnector spring, like this JP Enterprises one does, then you should absolutely make sure to change out the disconnector for the one that came with the spring set that you got. So if you're replacing the spring, it should be extremely easy to note what position the spring is in, and you can just swap the springs out. But if you took your spring off in order to bob the hammer, which is what I did, is I took the spring off to bob the hammer, you can just look at it here. You want the ears, as it was, facing away from where the hammer tail used to be. So the ears should be coming up and over on the side that the hammer face is on. See, make sure I'm getting that in there. So this is how it should look. See the ears come up and over, moving away from the hammer face, and it loops on the underside here. Pretty simple. Pretty straightforward. The trigger is even easier. So, get this guy on here, and boom. That's it. We have changed out the spring set. These JP Enterprise springs are like 10 or 20 bucks. They are pretty cheap. I think you can get cheaper springs from Joe Bob Outfitters, but honestly, I don't think that they're better. JP Enterprises makes the best stuff, and they'll tell you to bob your hammer if you are using their spring kit on a Milspec trigger set. And they will recommend that you bob the hammer and reduce the mass of the hammer. So there's that. But JP Enterprises is known for the quality of the products that they produce, and their springs are no different. Let me take this old spring, toss it over there. It can fuck off. All right, and now for the trigger spring. This one's very easy. It's kind of hard to fuck up, but if you need an example, and again, you're not really doing anything to the trigger, so you should be able to just look at the trigger and see how the spring is placed, and then just swap it out. But in case you need an example, here you go. And we're just going to take it off. And we're just going to put this other spring on. There we go, super easy. And now all we have to do is put the disconnector spring in. This little guy is super small, so it can be easy to lose track of it. Here we go. That is the disconnector spring. Is it any different than the disconnector spring that's in there? Honestly, I don't know, but it's what came with the JP Enterprises spring kit, so it is what I will be using. Yeah, this JP Enterprises disconnector spring is stiffer than the other spring, so that's probably going to make for a better trigger reset. If you put the small side down instead of the fat side of the spring down, and one side of the spring is slightly wider than the other, if you put the smaller side of the spring down, it's not going to stay in place, and more importantly, you're not going to be able to get your pins, your trigger pins through your disconnector and your trigger, and you're not going to be able to figure out why you're having such a hard time accomplishing that. It's because your spring's upside down, more than likely. So now we'll take our disconnector and we'll put it in here. It's important to note, some people will say, you should polish the contact points of the disconnector and polish where the hammer meets the trigger face. This is a nickel boron coated trigger. It's one of those nickel boron coated triggers, Milspec triggers, that comes with guns these days. They're extremely common. You'll find a lot of nickel boron coated Milspec triggers. It's one of the reasons I don't feel the need to polish anything, is because it's already a very slick surface. And also, it's important to emphasize, if you are going to polish any of those surfaces, that you use a polishing wheel, not sandpaper, not a grinding wheel. You do not want to take material off of any of those contact surfaces, because that is going to affect the safety and functionality of your trigger. That's how you get runaway triggers. That's how you get misfires. That's just how you get a lot of bad juju. So you absolutely 100% do not want to do it. And I typically don't recommend polishing triggers for that reason. Just if you want to get a cheap Milspec trigger, just get a nickel boron coated trigger. They're cheap as hell. They're almost as cheap as the nitrided triggers, so just do that instead. Get the nickel boron. It's already slick, and what I tend to do is just apply grease to all of the contact surfaces. But it's nickel boron, it's already pretty slick, and then with the grease, it's extremely smooth, don't have any problems. Now, since this is a tougher disconnect spring, it is going to be a little bit more fun to get those roll pins in, but I've got this, not roll pins, but trigger pins, and I've got this anti-walk pin set from Strike Industries. There was a cheaper set I could have gotten, but I like the way that these look better, and there's not a part that screws in that could come out. So I'm a little bit more of a fan of anti-walk pins that don't have an additional part that screws in. So we'll go ahead and dump that out. All right, now that we have our springs installed on our trigger and our hammer, we are going to go ahead and insert the trigger into the lower receiver, and then we're going to insert the disconnector, and then we're going to use one of the punches, the punch that we used earlier to knock the pins out. We're going to use that to kind of hold everything in place and guide the pin in. So go ahead and do that. One thing to keep in mind, it's important, if you don't let your spring get caught in this position. It will not, your trigger will not go, don't let your spring get caught in this position right here. Your trigger will not go into place and it will not align. You need to make sure that the spring is up over the trigger itself and properly placed. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time getting into position. You're not going to get into position if that's the case. So when your spring is properly placed, you will notice that the trigger aligns properly with the lower receiver. So now we're just going to go ahead and get our disconnector in. This is the fun part, because the disconnector is always harder to get aligned. Which is why you want to use the punch that you used previously to kind of guide everything into place. So I've used my punch to hold everything down. My disconnector is held in place by the punch. So now I can take this anti-walk pin and I can place it on the punch. And these anti-walk pins have an indent on the end of them on the side that guides in, which makes it extremely convenient because it aligns with the punch. Once you've got it through the disconnector, it's a simple matter of lining it up with the other side. So the real trick is getting it aligned with your disconnector. So there we go. That's on there. So next comes the hammer. Now, obviously, the face of the hammer needs to be facing towards the strike face, the strike plate right here on the lower receiver. You are going to take your spring and bend it forward. There will be tension. And you hear that click when I get it into place. That is because it connected with the trigger face. The hammer connected with the trigger face. Now this is a lot easier I tend to not use the guide method on this because it's not as intricate as the trigger itself, which has the disconnector, which makes things a little fucky. So this is not as bad. There we go, yeah. Just had to work it around a little bit. So now it's installed. That's it, it's done. And that is it. I have bobbed the tail of the trigger. I'm sorry, I have bobbed the tail of the hammer. I have put lighter springs on it, and I have installed anti-walk pins. And this thing is now good to go. So guys, I really appreciate you tuning in. There are better videos out there for installing a trigger, but I wanted to go ahead and just put out a video on modifications for your AR trigger that you can do yourself while still maintaining a safe trigger and a reliable trigger as well. So those JP Enterprises springs are fantastic. They do a great job. You just have to keep in mind that you need to reduce the mass of the hammer itself in order to maintain the reliability of your firearm. And once you've done that, you won't really have any problems. So thank you for tuning in and watching this, guys. If you liked the video, go ahead and hit like, subscribe. It helps me out a lot. If you didn't like the video, smash dislike. Tell me in the comment section below what you didn't like about the video and what you think I should do differently. If you have any comments or suggestions about what you'd like to see in the future, things that you would like me to review, or things that you would like to see me talk about as far as modifications to firearms go ahead and let me know, and I'll do a video on it. Or at the very least, I will answer your questions in the comment section below. But if you have suggestions on videos that you'd like to see, I'm going to go ahead and try to do those videos. So please leave the comments in the comment section below. I appreciate you stopping by. Remember to be kind, be compassionate, be empathetic, but still remember to be dangerous. And I'll see you next time.